Good morning. How are we this morning? Good? It's been a good meeting so far. All right. Well, we introduced a new series last week called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. I'm just going to get rid of my phone because it's going to be annoying. Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And last week, we started the series off by taking a look at the problem with unhealthy spirituality, emotionally unhealthy spirituality. And we took a look at the life of Saul. And we saw through his disobedience, I suppose, some key indicators of people who are emotionally and spiritually unhealthy. If we're in an unhealthy place, we say no to self-reflection. We say no to self-awareness. We get trapped in living to please people, in doing what other people want. And we can begin making decisions based on that instead of out of a place of relationship with God. Emotionally and spiritually unhealthy people, they say no to cultivating a relationship with God. They don't spend time with God. They don't spend time listening, reflecting, reading His Word. And unhealthy people, they say no to brokenness, to setbacks and difficulties, and to grow through those things. So they don't learn, they don't grow, they don't allow room for transformation through the experiences of life. And it's hard to hear some of that stuff, isn't it? The story that we looked at last week from 1 Samuel 15, it was particularly blunt, a little bit harsh even. And if your group's met this week, if you've done the first week of EHS like Kyle talked about, there's some hard stuff in there. It's challenging, there's a lot of room for growth. But I'm excited because over the next 7 weeks, we take a look at 7 pathways, 7 steps towards emotionally healthy spirituality, and that's where we're going to end up. And I just want to do another plug for life groups this morning. You are going to get the most out of this series if you're here on a Sunday, if you listen to the message, but also if you're part of a small group doing the course material. They're meant to work together. And my group met on Monday. I went to that same young adults life group that Kyle went to, and it was great. It was great to get together with a bunch of people and just be able to talk about life, but actually start asking each other some of these tough questions, starting to peel back the layer. And I found that it was helpful even in our first week meeting together. We're a fresh life group. So if you've been meeting together with your group for a while, I'm sure that you're going to get to great places by doing this study. So if you're not connected to a life group, I encourage you, go and see Amy today. Even if you just come and meet with another couple or another couple of people, come and get the material and make sure you start that this week. It's really great. So step number 1 that we're looking at today is know yourself so that you may know God. Know yourself so that you may know God. And it's about becoming our authentic self, about removing this layer of false self that we can sometimes be tempted to wear. And it so easily inhibits our relationship with other people, how we feel about ourselves, and our relationship with God. Peter Scazzero, the guy who writes this series, he says this: awareness of yourself and your relationship with God are intricately related. A key factor in emotional health is knowing ourselves, and that's where we have to start. And a couple of weeks ago, I did some psychometric testing as part of my application to go to training college because apparently they don't let crazy people be officers. And so I had to go, and you fill out all these tests. It was a weird experience, right? Because you fill out all this paperwork, you do all these online quizzes, and then you meet with someone and you get the results back and they tell you who you are. And if you're truthful in the testing component, that means the results are true, right? They're accurate. So it's kind of weird to read because some of the stuff you agree with, you really identify about those elements of yourself. You like those things about yourself. Like I have a high sense of self-actualization, which means I find purpose in the things that I'm doing. I set high expectations for myself. I've got a high level of social responsibility, which means I like to contribute to my community and the things I'm involved in. And my level of optimism is high. I'm generally pretty positive about life. And I like these things about myself. I like these things that I know about myself. So I'm like, yeah, that's great. But the test also showed that I'm not super flexible. See, I prefer predictability over spontaneity. And my dad's laughing right now. But I'm reading these test results and I'm thinking, hey, you know what? That's a little bit unfair. I am spontaneous sometimes in like a controlled environment. See, I know this about myself. I just don't necessarily like it about myself. Or perhaps more accurately, I don't think other people will like it about me. And so I can tend to suppress this part of myself that I know exists, that's part of my personality, because I'm worried about what other people think. Because everyone likes the fun, spontaneous person, right? So sometimes I squash that part of my personality down, and there's a real temptation for all of us to do that, to suppress who we really are. Or maybe for some of us, we've just never actually spent time figuring out who we really are, asking God who we really are, how he's wired us, what he's given us. And that's not a healthy way for us to go through life, and we're going to learn more about that today. See, if we're not in touch with ourselves, if we don't know how God's wired us, we can live in this false sense of self all the time, where we present in a certain way because we want people to like us, or because we think it's the right thing, or because we actually just don't want to peel back and be who we are because we're worried about the place that we're truly in. And this becomes dangerous because people don't see us as we truly are. We don't get to live as the people that we truly are. And most of all, it inhibits our relationship with God because we end up coming before him as a false self. We put up this front for him as well. And I wonder this morning, some symptoms are going to come up on the screen, some symptoms of false self. And I wonder if you take a look at these, if you can identify with any of them. Do you ever say yes when you really mean no? Have you ever needed to be approved by others to feel good about yourself? Do you sometimes criticize others to make yourself feel better? Do you avoid looking weak or foolish for not having the answer? Do you ever use knowledge or competence to cover your feelings of inadequacy? Do you compare yourself to lots of other people? See, if any of these are true for you, there might be some indication that we don't really know ourselves well, or that we do know ourselves, but we're afraid to let that show. We don't feel secure in who we are, and that limits our freedom in relationship with God. We have to know who we are. We have to know how God designed us as unique, individual human beings. And unlike Saul, who lived in fear, who lived for the approval of others, who didn't listen to God, David shows us how much better our life can be when we know ourselves and when we truly know God. So this morning, we're going to turn to perhaps one of the best known stories in Scripture. Most people, whether they're a Christian, whether they've picked up the Word of God or not, would know something of the story of David and Goliath, the shepherd boy versus the champion Philistine. Now, there was definitely a lot of poetic license in that video that we watched earlier, but you get the gist, the overall view of the story, right? The Philistines and the Israelites, they're ready for battle. They come together, and the Philistines, they send out this huge man called Goliath, who's equipped with all the armor and weaponry necessary for battle, this hand-to-hand combat. But his advantage is that he is ginormous, and none of the Israelites want to fight him. And so here enters David, this young shepherd. He's been sent by his father to deliver food and check on his brother in battle. And picking up from 1 Samuel 17, verse 23, we read, as he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. So this fires young David up. He can't believe what he's hearing. He can't believe what he's seeing from the Israelites. So he asks, what will be done for this man who kills the Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the rest is history, right? David volunteers, he faces Goliath, he kills him with a sling and some stones. Victory for the young, ill-equipped underdog David. Or at least that's somehow over time how this story has been shaped for us. But actually, that's not all the point of the story. The more I researched this week, the more I realised that David is not the underdog. And if you're at all interested in the history or the historical research behind this story, you should check out a TED Talk, if you put it into YouTube, by a guy called Malcolm Gladwell. Fascinating history behind some of this story. But in fact, David's victory, if we look at it like that, it was pretty certain. If we understand the scripture, it was certain because he was incredibly self-aware. and he was in deep relationship with God. So we're going to look at this story in a new way today. We're going to forget what has previously been set up for us, what this story has been built up to represent, and focus on David's security in himself and who he was in relationship with God, because David knew himself and he knew God. So in this story, there's 3 obstacles that David faces that he has to cut through to be his authentic self in God. 3 obstacles that probably would have changed the outcome of this story had David not been so self-aware, so self-assured, and sure of who his God was. So the first obstacle that David has to cut through is his family. See, when he arrives at the battle, he comes to his brother. He comes near his brother, and he's the youngest, right? David's the youngest of 8 boys, and 3 of his eldest brothers, they're all in Saul's army. And David's really just been sent to run errands for his father, to check in on the older, more important brothers. So when David arrives and starts asking questions, his eldest brother is quick to put him in his place. Verse 28 says, Eliab, his oldest brother, heard David fraternizing with the men and lost his temper. What are you doing here? Why aren't you minding your own business, tending to that scrawny flock of sheep? I know what you're up to. You've come down here to see the sights, hoping for a ringside seat at a bloody battle. Pretty good put down, hey? He basically says, you know what, David, you're worthless. You're a nobody. You're useless. Just go home. And for far too many people, this is the reality of family life. Sometimes there's parts of our true self that are deemed unacceptable, and we cover them up because of fear of rejection or hurt or ridicule or judgment. Even the best families, ones that love each other, can ultimately sometimes add to this false sense of self. So then the next obstacle that David comes to, the one that he must cut through again, is significant others with authority and experience. See, in David's case, this person is Saul. Saul is the leader of this army of 330,000 men. He knew what he was talking about. He had experience in battle just like this. But we learned last week that Saul made decisions based on what other people thought about him. He made decisions based on fear and not because of relationship with God. He didn't take the time to tune in to what God was saying. So when David goes to him and he says, Master, don't give up hope. I'm ready to go and fight this Philistine. Saul answers David, you can't go and fight this Philistine. You're too young. You're too inexperienced. And he's been at this fighting business since before you were born. I don't think you can do it, David. The odds are against you. And there may be people for you, maybe people that are coaches or teachers or experts in your field that have told you that you can't do something, that you can't be something. And actually, it is incredibly difficult for us to cut through this obstacle and figure out what God is actually saying and what God actually wants us to do in these moments. And then the third obstacle that David faces is Goliath, this huge, intimidating, tormenting giant. Verse 41 to 43 says, as the Philistine paced back and forth, his shield bearer in front of him, he noticed David. He took one look down at him and sneered, a mere youngster, apple-cheeked and peach-fuzzed. The Philistine ridiculed David. Am I a dog that you come after me with a stick? And he cursed him by his gods. See, Goliath mocked and threatened David. He was bigger than David. He had armor. He had a shield bearer and a sword. He was scary. Giants are scary, right? They intimidate us. They freak us out. They make us feel small. And perhaps there's a metaphorical giant in your life that you're facing today and you don't know how to cut through it. See, these 3 things, they're pretty big obstacles for us to cut through. And to some extent, we all face each one of them, or at least elements of each one of them. We play our false self around our family. We try and live up to expectations that are placed on us, whether intentional or not. We want to appear successful to the people that we respect. We want to conform or please people in authority, or perhaps we're just fearful of the things that life throws at us and we let that control who we become instead of turning to God, instead of being sure and certain of who we are and where we stand in relationship with Him. But even though David faced these obstacles, that wasn't how it turned out. That wasn't David's story. He didn't let them stop him. His response to each one of these, it shows us a better way to be. He responds to each obstacle as a person who is truly in touch with himself. He knows himself and he knows who his God is. See, David exemplifies the key to living this way by introducing a concept called differentiation. And what differentiation is a person's capacity to define his or her own life's goals and values apart from the pressures of those around them. A person's capacity to define his or her own life goals and values apart from the pressures of those around them. And this is what David does in this story as he faces these three obstacles. See, when David's brother questions him, instead of running off scared or crumbling in the moment, he just turns to his brother and says, "What's with it with you? All I did was ask a question." And ignoring his brother, he turned to someone else, asked the same question, and got the same answer as before. See, what David knows about himself as he cuts through this obstacle is that his motives are pure. He wasn't doing what his brother had accused him of. He loves God and he wants to honour and serve him. He's absolutely sure about that. So he knows what his brother's saying about him is untrue. And he's not afraid to hold on to what he thinks is right. It's not to say that everything that his family has taught him has been wrong. Our family shape the people that we are. But he knows himself well enough to be able to see himself apart from his brother and not to make decisions based on his brother's opinion of him. Not because he doesn't value the opinion of his brother, but because he places higher value on the opinion of God rather than the opinion of his brother. And then when David faces Saul, what he knows about himself is that he has won battles before. David's prior experience gave him confidence. See, David said, "I've been a shepherd, tending sheep for my father. Whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I'd go after it, knock it down and rescue the lamb. If it turned on me, I'd grab it by the throat, wring its neck and kill it. Lion or bear, it made no difference. I killed it, and I'll do the same to this Philistine pig who is taunting the troops of God alive. God who delivered me from the teeth of the lion and the claws of the bear will deliver me from this Philistine." See, David knew that no matter what he faced, the outcome for him would be as it always had been. His experience had set him up from the future, and I'm guessing in the moment when David faced a bear or a lion, he was probably freaking out a little bit. But each one of those things that he faced, they taught him what he was capable of doing, and they set him up for that future victory. David spent time reflecting on what God had done for him, and maybe some of us need to do the same this morning so that we can figure out what we're capable of doing in the future. David knew he could do it because he had before. And then when Saul eventually lets David go, when he agrees to let him fight Goliath, he asks David to put on his armour. So David tries to put on this armour and he walks around in it for a little while, but actually it just doesn't fit. It wasn't David's armour. David knew that he had no chance of defeating this Philistine if he pretended to be someone that he was not. David knew what he was good at, the way that God had wired him, and it wasn't to hand-to-hand combat with a sword and a shield. Actually, if he'd gone out in Saul's armour, it was too big for him, that didn't fit, the chances are that David would have been killed. Saul wanted the best for David. He wanted him to win, obviously, but he didn't know David like David did, and he didn't know God like David did. So what's the key here then, I guess? Because there's a very fine line, isn't there, between listening to others, letting them be real about our skills, about our personality, and being totally delusional. See, the key is not that we throw out counsel. We need trusted advisors in our life. We need people who share with us, who we trust to give us guidance in our best interest. There's a real high chance for us of self-deception if we don't do this. If we don't have people who are spiritually mature, trusted companions who speak into our lives. So it can be dangerous to cut through this second obstacle if we're not emotionally mature. We need spiritually mature, trusted companions in our life. And what we need to do is to continually be coming back to God and asking ourselves, is what this person's saying to me highlighting something true or inconsistent in my personality? We need trusted advisors, but we need to come back to God. And then when we get to the actual battle, we see the height of David's ability, I suppose, to live within his authentic self. And I suppose this is mostly where our blurred understanding of this story comes into play. See, David's ditched Saul's armour and he's brought with him a sling and some smooth stones. And at this point in the story, we tend to pitch it like, all David had was a couple of stones and a little sling. Like it puts him at a disadvantage or something like that. Like he's a dumb kid that just picked up the first thing that he saw. But that's actually not the case. Because if we understand the history and how these slings were used, we understand that in the hands of a skilled warrior, these slings were known to be deadly accurate. They were a war weapon. See, in Judges 20, verse 16, it tells us when the Benjamite army is being described. We're told about these 700 men, right? 700 men who were part of the army who could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. A stone at a hair. I want to see that happen on YouTube, right? See, Goliath's challenge when he meets David is to single-hand combat. Man on man, right up near each other. And Goliath is expecting that someone's going to meet him within sword's distance. So when he sees David, he's sure that he can beat him. He was bigger than David, but David knew himself better to try and fight this way. See, David's not naive to the realities of war. Sometimes we forget that actually David had been in Saul's service. He played music for Saul, but he knew about war. He didn't just wander up to battle delusional about the military activity of the day. He'd seen that he could defeat this champion of single-hand combat by getting to him before he even had to get up close. And that's what he does. He knows himself, and even under pressure and resistance, he allows God to work through who he is. And maybe for some of us, if we face pressure, when we face giants, or even just as we walk through the day-to-day, we might feel the need to live in our false self, to be something that we're not. And maybe what we need to do is actually just use what we have. Be who we are. Because I think sometimes we wait for this big solution to drop, and God's just saying, you know what? I've given you some stones. I've given you some slings. Just use them. And we've just got to pick them up and learn to be more secure in who God has designed us to be. See, let's give Goliath some credit where he's due. Goliath was sure of himself, wasn't he? The first part of our pathway today, know yourself, Goliath had that down pat. But the thing with Goliath is, God meant nothing to him. He defiled God, and that was definitely his downfall. But David, he was sure of himself and he knew God, and that is a powerful combination. David loved God. He honoured God. He spent time with God. And you know what? David had been anointed. And I think for me, as I looked at this story this week, this is what shocked me the most as I reread it. Why do we keep referring to David as the underdog in this situation? He has been anointed. In the chapter before, you read in 1 Samuel 16:13, before the battle's taken place, Samuel anoints David. And what happens? The Spirit of the Lord comes powerfully upon David. David's been anointed. God was with him. So his victory, when we read it in light of that, when we read it in light of God's promise and his faithfulness, the victory for David should seem like a no-brainer. David knew himself. David knew God. And that combination, that powerful combination of knowing ourselves and knowing God, it sets the foundation for our ability to grow in emotionally healthy spirituality. So this morning, we're going to spend some time in reflection, in self-reflection once again. I don't know if anyone's tried this week to spend a couple of minutes each day in silence, listening to God, asking him, what he wants from us. But this morning, I want to encourage you to reflect on who you are. Do you really know yourself? Reflect on the things about yourself that maybe you perhaps try and cover up sometimes, that you don't necessarily use, because I think it's those things sometimes that God really wants to take and he wants to use. We're going to sing the chorus of this song, all that I am, all I can be, all that I have, all that is me, accept and use, Lord, as you would choose, Lord, right now today. All that I have, every single part of me. Like that video said, you might want to come this morning and bring your stuff. All these parts that you sometimes try and cover up, you try and close up, you pretend that they don't exist. God wants you to bring them before him, to come before him exactly as you are. To be more like David than like Saul. We want to stop living in our false self. We want to peel back the layer and we want to start being our authentic self, in touch with who we are. Not living to please people, not living to